They laughed when the lawyer read it aloud. The room hummed with cheap chandeliers and thinner hopes. Faces tightened. Paper rustled. Marcus stood close to the oak table, palms empty, jaw set. His stepbrothers, Ethan and Charles, exchanged looks that were half smirk, half calculated triumph. Cash and a small house were named, shelves and bank ledgers. To Marcus, a single line. To Marcus, I leave the Cadillac. Laughter filled the corners like smoke. Someone said, loud enough for the room to swallow it, "A what? A junker?" The word arrived like a verdict. Phones came out to take pictures. Under the light, the Cadillac in the will, old, indented by time and ink, meant nothing to them. It meant everything to a man whose face lay quiet and unreadable. Marcus accepted the key without a word. It was small and greasy, the kind that fit knuckles densest with cold. He walked out to the street where a tow truck idled, the driver whistling through cracked teeth. People made jokes. A neighbor he barely knew clapped him on the shoulder with hollow sympathy and called him lucky, as if name and sign could smooth what had been torn. If this story finds you, and you like these slow recoveries of ordinary things, subscribe. There are more like this. He drove the car home on an afternoon that smelled of rain and old coffee. The Cadillac was worse than he expected. Caked dust, a cracked bench seat that held the night's size, chrome pitted like a moon scar. Its paint was a tired green, a color between hunter and seaweed. The engine coughed when he turned the key. It coughed again. He didn't curse. He listened. He slept that first night in the small apartment he kept above a dry cleaner, on the couch, the radio muttering old blues. But he pushed the Cadillac into the alley and wrapped a blanket over the front end. He set an old cardboard box beside the passenger seat that would hold the car manual he never found, a flashlight, and a bottle of lemon oil. He woke early, hands in work gloves, cold and clean, and wiped the hood in slow, almost reverent circles until his own breath fogged. He learned the car by touch, the weight of the hood, the give of the steering, the roughness of the leather where children had once pressed knees. Mrs. Lang from next door leaned on the rail and watched him one Sunday, a cup steaming in a chipped saucer. "Folks are cruel, Marcus," she said, not unkind. "But that old thing has stories. I like the way you look at it." "I don't know its stories yet," he said. He could have told her what it meant, that his father had been careful and stern, that there had been a time when words were scarce and lessons did the talking. He could have said his father had left more than a car. He'd left a quiet test, an invitation to look for worth where others threw up their hands. Marcus only folded his jacket tighter and kept working. The car club met on Saturday mornings in a converted warehouse near the river.
Grease-scarred men and women swept undercarriages and traded small triumphs. A carburetor found, a bolt that fit after a dozen tries. Inside, a radio played a weathered tune. Someone hammered a fender with patient percussion. The air smelled of oil and metal filings. Laya, who ran a small restoration blog, was there, hair tied back, glasses crooked, elbows in the grease. Frank, the mechanic with a grin that had been earned through decades of stubbornness, wiped his hands and walked around the Cadillac like a priest inspecting relics. They greeted the car with the kind of attention it demanded. Laya tapped the chassis plate, a rectangle of metal under the driver's side, and frowned. "This stamping isn't right," she said, fingers tracing numbers and letters like someone reading a poem. Frank leaned in, flashlight held at an angle. "Hand-stamped parts," he muttered. "See? Someone took their time. Not factory line. Someone who cared." They lifted panels, checked bolts, counted spokes. The interior smelled of old varnish and something else, an oil commonly used by people who expected their work to last. Behind the seat, a strip of glued fabric held a stash of old receipts and a soggy pack of matches. Marcus's fingers found the envelope by accident. It wasn't much, just a piece of paper softened at the edges, brown where hands had been. His name was on it, written in a familiar, uneven scrawl. The signature at the bottom was simply an initial in a line, M. He held the envelope closed against his palm for a long moment. He could have read it then. The room hummed with other voices, Laya asking about the paint, Frank making his usual joke about parts that refused to be resurrected. He kept his thumb over the flap. That small restraint felt like a promise. Verification moved like a slow, conscientious detective story. They took photos, close, clinical, reverent. Laya sat at a table with a laptop, comparing the car's idiosyncrasies with databases, records, clipped magazine articles that smelled faintly of old smoke. Frank disassembled a section of the engine to inspect the serials. Each discovery was a whisper. Each whisper gathered weight. It wasn't spectacle. It was patient, methodical work. Dimensions measured, old paint samples swabbed, a tiny hand-stamped bolt compared against a reference book with thin, well-read pages. At night, alone, Marcus thought about the mockery that had followed him. He opened the envelope. His eyes skimmed the paper, and then slowed, reading not for what was hidden, but for what the handwriting asked of him. The letter did not brag. It was compact and frank. It spoke of survival. It told the story of a man who kept his pride small and his hands busy. It instructed against hasty sales, against the temptation to trade something learned over a life for quick ease. It asked that Marcus, if he could, teach what he learned.
It told him, simply, to help those who had once had the luxury to be cruel if they found themselves at the bottom. Work before alms. It closed with that initial and a line, as if the signature itself were enough. M. When the first outside voice confirmed the hunch, the room changed. The museum curator came like someone bringing daylight. She had a precise way of pronouncing improbabilities as fact. "This is rarer than we thought," she said, only half to Marcus and half to herself. Her note was gentle and astonished, like someone who had found a small, private treasure in a junk drawer. She offered a route: display, preservation, a story told in glass and soft lighting. The press arrived soon after, not with shouts, but with curiosity. They wanted to know why the car mattered. The articles used words like recovered and preserved, and neighbors who had once chuckled looked at Marcus with different, quieter eyes. Offers arrived as letters and meetings and polite phone calls. There was a courtesy to all of it, an acknowledgement that what they had was not junk. Marcus listened to each one, folding and unfolding them in his hands like a rosary. He felt the pressure of the city's attention. A museum wanted the car. The museum had a cloak of legitimacy and a schedule of light and glass. They spoke softly about royalties and exhibitions and a plaque to tell the car's story. Marcus said one condition no one expected. He wanted the plaque to include his father's name, not as a footnote, but as the voice of what the museum called context, a recognition that the car had been kept through intention, through choices that had been small and steady. He wanted the letter's essence honored: patience, rebuilding, teaching. The curator nodded as though this detail belonged to the heart of the piece. "We will do that," she said. "We will tell it true." The museum opening was clean and civilized. The Cadillac sat like a patient island under soft lights. People moved in ripples around it, cameras soft and respectful. When the plaque was unveiled, it read of a family, of care, of restraint, of lessons taught by hands instead of sermons. It mentioned the father with the initial M, and in small text a phrase that kept appearing in Marcus's head: "Worth is often what someone is willing to rebuild." The museum's respect did not make Marcus loud. He stood with his hands in his pockets and let the present wash through him. The polished chrome, the reflection of a child's face pressing to the glass, the steady clip of a curator's heels. Marcus opened the envelope in front of the curator before the photo lights arrived. He read aloud, not the letter verbatim, but the spirit of it. He spoke of survival, the way his father had made ends meet, how he had learned to stretch a dollar and fix what others threw away. He read the counsel about patience. Don't sell something before you understand what it can become.
He read that the final instruction was not to hoard advantage, but to teach others to find it. If those who once scorned you stumbled, offer work, not pity. The pause after that line filled the gallery. It was a small, powerful hush, like the quiet when a song ends and people are not yet willing to leave. Cameras recorded the moment. Headlines had their fun, but the truth in that quiet was private. Marcus did not climb any podium. He did not boast. He handed the envelope back into the curator's care, leaving the physical words to the archive and keeping their meaning in his head like a compass. With the museum's support, enough to cover restoration and to seed an idea, Marcus set up a workshop in the neighborhood, a long, narrow space above a shuttered storefront with a broken sign. Kids from blocks away came with scraped knees and wide attention. Some were curious about engines. Some wanted a place off the street. Marcus taught them with small lessons: how to grease a bearing, how to listen to the sound of a crankshaft, how to sand down a broken edge until it felt like new. He taught them to hold a file steady and to be patient in their strokes. He taught, above all, that a careful hand can make something lasting. The workshop smelled of oil and lemon polish, like the mornings he'd spent with the Cadillac. A radio tuned to a distant station filled the room with soft saxophone. They worked with bacon-brown rags and drilled and learned not to be hasty. A young boy who kept asking for a chance learned to weld. A girl, meticulous and careful, became the master of sanding. They found pride in the small things: a bolt that turned, a piece that fit. Marcus never demanded gratitude. He expected work.
The kids responded with attention, and their parents with relief. The neighborhood learned to call the place by a name Marcus didn't mind: the garage. Ethan and Charles returned on a rainy afternoon. The city had a way of narrowing the options for those who had once chosen ease. The two of them were a little thinner around the edges, their shirts pressed but their eyes raw with the kind of worry that debt tightens into. They stood in the doorway and watched the kids work, hands tucked into each other, mouths set. Marcus remembered the laughter at the will reading. He remembered the smirks in the photographs. The old temptation to show them the museum lights and the plaques rose in him, because it would have been easy to let pride speak through a trophy. Instead, he met them at the workbench. He handed them gloves. "We need bench hands," he said. His voice was flat, neither kind nor cruel. "You can start with degreasing." They balked. For a moment, old gestures returned, an apology that smelled of shame and a shrug that smelled of resentment. Then, slow, not dramatic, Ethan rolled his sleeves up. Charles learned to thread a bolt with a stubbornness that had been dulled by easy money.
They worked in the rain-washing light, hands learning again the discipline of a steady task. The brothers did not instantly become saints. They muttered and resisted. There were days when they disappeared, and days when they returned with soiled shirts and clearer eyes. Marcus didn't lecture them. He assigned tasks and let the work do the teaching. At night, they sat around a table with mugs of cheap coffee and talked in smaller ways, about bills and missteps and the quiet ways they had been wrong. The repair of cars was mirrored by the repair of a family that had been brittle and proud. The museum asked Marcus to give a short reflection at an anniversary, an intimate affair with a modest crowd. They wanted him to speak about the car's history, about restoration, about the city that had learned to see. He prepared a sentence he would use, and then let it go. When the microphone hummed and the light softened, he said fewer words than people expected. "What looks worthless," he said, "is sometimes just waiting for someone who knows how to fix it." He paused, looks meeting faces in the room. Neighbors, kids from the garage, the curator, Ethan and Charles at the edge of the group. "My father taught me to hold things long enough to know what they could be." He didn't say that to get praise. He did it so someone would learn the work of making things whole. Applause came like rain, polite then earnest. Ethan and Charles did not step forward then. They had already stepped forward in the workroom. Their repair of pride took longer than the unveiling. The plaque, which had been Marcus's insistence, had been placed at eye level. The curator had agreed to frame the story not as a triumph of wealth, but as a lesson. It said simply enough, "This automobile was kept and cared for by a man who believed in patient work." It inspired a place where young hands learned to restore both machines and hope. In the weeks after, the garage became less an experiment and more a pattern. The museum made occasional donations, small and steady. Visitors came by, sometimes to learn, sometimes to offer a part they thought might help. Marcus managed the finances with the same care he used on bolts. No splashy gestures, no flash. The kids learned trades and a discipline that held them long after the workday ended. Neighbors, too, changed their looks. Mrs. Lang would bring in loaves of bread and set them on the workbench. Leah wrote a short feature and came by when she could to teach the kids how to photograph restoration progress. Frank kept coming with his jokes and an inexhaustible supply of advice, and sometimes a rare part he'd managed to find in the deep network of old men who loved cars like archives. Ethan and Charles found steadier ground. They learned to keep appointments. They learned that shame did not dissolve in money, but in the slow acquisition of trust. Marcus watched them from the edge sometimes, arms folded, content to let them prove themselves the Maxwith.
On a wet evening, the three of them stood before the car as a town had come to know it. Chrome catching streetlight like pages, the windows fogged from the warmth inside. Marcus laid his palm on the hood. It was cool, the metal a steady testament to time. "You were right to keep it," Ethan said afterward, quieter than the man who'd once laughed. Marcus tilted his head. He did not say, "I told you so." He said instead, "It wasn't mine to prove, only to see." There was a meaning in the sentence that did not need to be unpacked. It was the kind of answer that tightens or loosens, depending on how a person chooses to hear it. The town's view changed slowly. The museum curated the Cadillac in glass and small captions. The kids from Marcus's garage were invited to show a piece at a local fair, one made from a reclaimed panel that shone like a modest new moon. They were nervous and proud in equal measure. A few of them found apprenticeships in other shops. One young woman left a note, taped to the bathroom mirror of the garage, thanking Marcus for teaching her hands how to listen to machines. He read it and folded it into his jacket like an old coin. Years passed with the evenness of a good engine.
the Cadillac remained a centerpiece in the museum. The plaque told a story, but the real change lived in the narrower spaces. Under a rooftop where a boy learned to weld. In the pause of a man who once laughed, and now asked for tools rather than help. Marcus still woke up early and polished by habit. He sometimes drove the Cadillac in the half-light, not to show it off, but to hear the engine purr, and to feel the history he had been entrusted to steward. On a rainy morning, as trains called in the distance, Marcus stood at the garage door and watched a new class of kids file in, bright-eyed and dirty-handed. He breathed in lemon oil and coffee steam, and the faint tang of warm metal. He thought of the mockery in the lawyer's office, of faces that had collected like flotsam and drifted away, and of a small envelope with a single M stitched at the end. He felt neither triumph nor bitterness. He felt the steady satisfaction of work done because it needed doing. In the museum window, the Cadillac gleamed. The plaque listed names and lessons, and there, in plain enough ink, the father's initial rested like a quiet signature. Marcus ran his thumb over the glass of the display case when he had a moment, the movement automatic, respecting the barrier between public treasure and private memory. He had been given a thing many had called worthless. He had looked at it, touched it, listened to it, and found that it carried secrets of worth that had nothing to do with price. It carried patience, the discipline of hands, and a quiet invitation to teach. Ethan and Charles stood beside him sometimes, not as men forgiven with a flourish, but as partners in a long, steady enterprise. They held tools like a kind of confession.
The town grew more generous in its attention to the garage. People who might once have gossiped about a strange inheritance now brought their grandchildren to see the Cadillac and hear in a measured voice how small acts of care can outlast loud proclamations. Marcus never claimed to be a savior. He never wanted a statue. The work itself was the reward. A boy who found work instead of wandering. A mother who could rely on repairs made with care. A community that learned to see value where it hadn't before. The Cadillac held its secrets in plain sight. Hand-stamped parts, careful late-night repairs, a letter tucked into a seam. But the truest secret was simpler still. A lesson handed down, not with fanfare, but inside an envelope, with an initial like a seal. When the museum celebrated the 5th anniversary of the car's display, Marcus stood beside the curator on a mild afternoon. People pressed in, families with cell phones and faces ready to be part of a story. He said one line that landed with the rest. What looks like scrap may be a story waiting on someone to listen. If you let it, it will teach you how to fix more than machines. They applauded with the polite sincerity of a crowd who had watched something turn from scrap to story. Outside, rain began to dot the pavement, little stars across the concrete. In the garage, a kid pressed his ear to a hood, learning the language of engines. In the museum, the Cadillac glinted back, as if remembering its long nights under a blanket and the slow hands that had brought it to light. If this quiet place of repair has moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that worth is often what we're willing to restore. The Cadillac stayed where it belonged, both a public memory and a private lesson, and the town kept learning that sometimes the best inheritance is a hand that shows you not only what to keep, but how to heal it.